Good evening, my friends. As a businessman and author who has had the privilege of connecting with millions across various platforms, I often observe the profound principles that govern success, influence, and enduring impact in our modern world. Tonight, I want to share a compelling narrative about a recent event in the media landscape, not to condemn, but to illuminate universal truths about integrity, audience connection, and the foundational elements of any thriving enterprise. We witnessed a prominent figure in late-night television, a man with access to millions of households, make what can only be described as a significant misstep, a comment so out of alignment with principles of respect and truth that it didn't just backfire, it revealed profound cracks in a once solid foundation. This wasn't merely about humor missing its mark. This was about the erosion of trust, the undermining of credibility, and the moment when even powerful organizations recognize that protecting a liability can no longer be justified. Let's consider the catalyst. The nation was still reeling from a tragic event, the assassination of Charlie Kirk. In times of profound sorrow, true leadership and influence call for reflection, empathy, and a spirit of unity. It's a moment to offer solace, to comfort those who mourn, and to seek common ground. Instead, the late-night host chose to transform this solemn occasion into material for his monologue. This was not comedy in its purest sense. It was a departure from genuine connection. He presented a narrative that was demonstrably false, suggesting a political alignment for the killer that contradicted the emerging facts. Think about the gravity of that moment. A young life lost for his political beliefs, and the tragedy was twisted into a weapon against those who grieved him. As the truth began to emerge from diligent police investigations and court documents, a vastly different picture was painted. The killer was not aligned with the very group the host suggested. Rather, he was a radical leftist, motivated by ideologies directly opposed to Kirk's message. The evidence was overwhelming. Text messages, social media posts, even inscriptions on the bullets used in the attack, all pointing to someone who harbored deep animosity for what Kirk represented and sought to silence that voice permanently. But the story didn't end there. In what many, including myself as a businessman and author, would consider a moment of profound insensitivity, the host then mocked President Trump's sincere grief over Kirk's passing. He likened the president's sorrow to that of a child mourning a goldfish. Can you imagine? A sitting president expressing genuine human sorrow over the assassination of a young American. And this became fodder for cheap laughs. Now, as a businessman and author, I understand the desire to push boundaries and capture attention. But what transpired that night transcended boundary pushing. It was an exploitation of genuine human tragedy for political advantage. It was taking a family's deep grief, a community's profound loss, and weaponizing it against political opponents. That's not entertainment. It's something far more concerning, a deviation from the principles of respect and empathy that underpin true connection. The ripple effect was swift and surprising, even to Hollywood insiders. In times past, such comments might have generated temporary outrage, perhaps a few angry social media posts, and then faded. The entertainment industry often followed a predictable pattern: a controversial statement, a mild apology, and within a few weeks, the cycle would continue. The system, it seemed, often protected its own, especially when statements aligned with prevailing industry perspectives. But this time, something fundamentally different occurred. Within hours of the monologue, Brendan Carr, the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, issued a public statement that sent shockwaves throughout the entertainment world. Now, as a businessman, I recognize the significance here. The FCC typically focuses on the technical aspects of broadcasting. For them to address content of this nature was almost unprecedented. Chairman Carr's words were unequivocal. He deemed the host's conduct some of the sickest behavior possible, and clearly indicated that the FCC was exploring potential action. Crucially, he reminded everyone of a fundamental truth. Broadcast networks utilize public airwaves and therefore carry special obligations to serve the public interest, responsibilities that cable and streaming services do not share. This wasn't mere regulatory posturing. When the chairman of the FCC discusses broadcast licenses and public interest obligations, network executives, overseeing billion-dollar operations, pay very close attention. What initially seemed like another late-night controversy quickly escalated into a potential breach of public trust, with significant financial implications. The true seismic shift, however, came from an unexpected quarter. The very broadcasters who had carried the host show for years began to distance themselves. Within days, major broadcast groups reaching tens of millions of American homes made announcements that would have been unimaginable just months prior. Nexstar, operating more television stations than any other company in America, reaching nearly 4 out of every 10 households, declared it would no longer air Jimmy Kimmel Live on its ABC affiliates. Consider the sheer scale of that decision. Nearly 40% of American television households lost access to the show in one stroke. Then Sinclair Broadcasting, another industry giant, made a similar announcement, but went even further, truly demonstrating the dramatic shift. Instead of merely dropping the show, they announced they would fill the vacated time slot with a special honoring Charlie Kirk's memory and his mission. They even publicly called on the host to make a substantial donation to Kirk's organization, Turning Point USA, as a gesture of accountability. Could we have imagined this 5 or 10 years ago? A major broadcasting company not only dropping a network show over its political content, but then using that very slot to honor the person the host had mocked? It was a complete reversal of how these dynamics typically unfolded. And this is where, as a businessman, the story becomes even more compelling. The network didn't just pause, they pulled the plug. To understand this, we must look behind the scenes at ABC and Disney. These are not conservative organizations. Disney, owning ABC, had been comfortable for years with content that leaned politically left. Their decision wasn't a sudden shift in political sensibility. No, what occurred was far more significant and rooted in sound business principles. Disney executives were reportedly incensed, not primarily by the host's politics, but by the profound business liability his comments had created. Here was a host who had taken a national tragedy and transformed it into a significant risk for the entire network. Sponsors became nervous, affiliate stations openly rebelled, regulatory agencies posed serious questions. And all this was happening around a show that, frankly, wasn't performing well enough to justify such an enormous headache. The decision to suspend the show indefinitely emanated from the highest echelons of Disney's corporate structure. This wasn't a middle manager trying to avoid controversy. This was a calculated business decision made by leaders who understood that protecting this individual was no longer a viable option from a cost-benefit perspective. The timing was particularly salient, sending a powerful message throughout Hollywood. The rules had indeed changed. For decades, the entertainment industry operated under the assumption that political controversy from a certain perspective was generally safe ground. Pushing traditional boundaries, critiquing conventional values, taking aim at certain political figures, all of this was often not just acceptable, but even lauded within industry circles. But the Kimmel situation demonstrated that real consequences now existed for venturing too far, especially when comments become so inflammatory that they threaten the very business model. Suddenly, the protective shield that the entertainment industry had long provided began to crack. But this wasn't merely about one offensive remark. It was interwoven with a larger trend that had been developing for years. If we truly want to understand why this individual's career experienced such a rapid decline, we must look at the numbers, the underlying realities that were already working against him. The uncomfortable truth that Disney executives had been attempting to sidestep was that his show had been struggling for quite some time, even before this specific controversy. By late 2024, the show was barely attracting 1 million viewers nightly, and that was on a good night. To put that in perspective, there are independent content creators operating from their homes who achieve greater daily viewership than a major broadcast network production. Meanwhile, on another network, a different late-night show was consistently drawing over 3 million viewers, more than triple his audience. This wasn't a temporary dip. The data clearly indicated a steady decline over several years, with the show losing viewers at a rate of 10 to 15% annually. For a production costing millions to produce, requiring a large, high-salaried staff, those numbers represented a significant problem that extended far beyond political leanings. What exacerbated the challenge for the network was the demographic profile of the remaining audience. It was heavily concentrated in older, affluent segments that advertisers were increasingly moving away from. The younger demographics, so crucial to advertisers, were finding their entertainment and commentary from entirely different sources: podcasts, streaming platforms, and social media creators who could offer real-time responses to current events, unconstrained by traditional broadcast schedules. As a businessman, I can tell you that ABC executives had been quietly exploring exit strategies for months before the Kirk controversy provided them with the perfect, albeit tragic, opportunity. When you're already experiencing financial drain from a show with diminishing relevance, And that show then ignites a massive public relations crisis that jeopardizes broader business relationships. The decision, from a corporate perspective, becomes remarkably clear. And here's where, as an author, I find the narrative particularly intriguing. While this individual's ratings were in free fall, alternative, often more principled voices were experiencing unprecedented growth. The success of the alternative late-night show wasn't just about beating the competition. It was experiencing year-over-year increases of 20 to 30%, while nearly every other late-night program was declining. The audience was undeniably there for comedy and commentary, but they were consciously choosing different voice to provide it. This created a fascinating dynamic in the entertainment industry. For years, Hollywood had operated under the assumption that content aligning with certain viewpoints was a niche market with limited appeal. The success of shows that respected diverse perspectives, coupled with the decline of traditionally divisive comedy, forced entertainment executives to reevaluate fundamental assumptions about what American audiences truly desired. So if ratings were already slipping, why did this specific comment trigger the collapse? The answer reveals a deeper cultural and principled shift. The truth is, the host's attack on Charlie Kirk's memory wasn't just perceived as a tasteless joke. It became symbolic of everything millions of Americans felt was wrong with mainstream entertainment. Here was a financially privileged comedian, insulated within Hollywood, using his platform to disseminate false information about a tragic event, all to score ephemeral political points against grieving individuals. For many viewers, this crystallized a long-held sentiment that late-night television had ceased being about entertainment and had become a weapon in cultural and political skirmishes. The traditional lines between news, commentary, and comedy had completely blurred, leaving audiences feeling lectured rather than genuinely entertained. What made the situation particularly damaging was the ease with which his claims could be disproven. Within hours of his monologue, people were sharing official police reports, court documents, and verified information that utterly contradicted his narrative. Social media platforms were flooded with corrections, not from partisan sources, but from authoritative law enforcement and judicial proceedings. This created something rarely seen in the traditional media era: a late-night host being publicly and definitively shown to be factually incorrect on major claims, not by political opponents, but by objective legal processes. The conventional model of television comedy had relied on the host's ability to set the narrative and move on before meaningful challenges could surface. But in today's transparent information environment, that luxury simply no longer exists. Even more significantly, the backlash originated from unexpected quarters. Social media personalities who typically did not align with conservative politics began speaking out. Jeffree Star, a renowned entrepreneur, makeup artist, and influencer with millions of followers, used his appearance on a major talk show to defend Charlie Kirk and critique the celebration of his death. Here was an individual from a distinctly different demographic and cultural background, taking a stand that traditionally would have been considered politically risky. Star experienced a temporary loss of followers, but gained hundreds of thousands of new ones who appreciated his willingness to prioritize basic human decency and truth over political tribalism. This pattern resonated across social media, with creators discovering that audiences yearn for voices willing to reject the most extreme partisan rhetoric in favor of more thoughtful, principled perspectives. And that outrage opened the door to something far larger: a fundamental rebalancing of cultural power. What happened to this host represents something much bigger than one comedian's downfall. For the first time in decades, we are witnessing the entertainment industry's cultural dominance genuinely challenged in ways that create tangible consequences for major media figures. Consider how this would have played out just a few years ago. The entertainment industry had perfected sophisticated mechanisms for weathering such storms. Publicists skilled at narrative management, sympathetic entertainment reporters offering favorable coverage, and audiences with limited alternatives if they disliked the offerings. But that entire ecosystem has been fundamentally disrupted. When the comments about Charlie Kirk were made, the host wasn't just facing criticism from traditional media or political opponents. He was confronting immediate, sustained pushback from independent creators, podcasters, and social media personalities who could reach vast audiences directly, circumventing traditional media gatekeepers. More importantly, these alternative voices could provide context and factual corrections in real time, something unprecedented during the zenith of television's cultural power. Within hours, people could access police reports, court documents, and verified information that directly contradicted the host's narrative. The traditional advantage television hosts once held, the ability to make claims and move on before facing meaningful scrutiny, had completely evaporated. This created a perfect storm that the entertainment industry was ill-equipped to handle. Network executives found themselves grappling not just with traditional political controversy, but with a sustained information campaign that was eroding their host's credibility in real time. Affiliate stations were fielding calls from viewers who could cite specific evidence contradicting what they had just seen on their network programming. What made this particularly devastating for someone whose brand was built on appearing informed and morally authoritative was that late-night comedy had evolved beyond simple entertainment. These hosts had positioned themselves as trusted sources of political commentary and cultural guidance. When that carefully constructed credibility is shattered by verifiable facts, the entire foundation of the show's appeal collapses. And this brings us to a fascinating historical parallel that, as an author, I believe illuminates what we are truly witnessing. There was a time when a handful of major television networks could essentially steer the national conversation. 3 or 4 executives in New York and Los Angeles could largely dictate what topics Americans discussed, which political figures would be taken seriously, and what cultural values would be promoted or ridiculed. This system endured for decades because alternatives were scarce. If you sought entertainment or news, you generally had to go through these established gatekeepers. But much like the internet transformed traditional retail, or electric vehicles are revolutionizing the automotive industry, new technologies and platforms have irrevocably shattered the old media monopoly. For decades, comedians could shape public narratives with minimal pushback. Their monologues aired late. Most people learned of the content secondhand, if at all. By the time any criticism might emerge, they had moved on to new topics. It was a system that heavily favored the host's perspective, whatever that might be. However, the rise of powerful, independent voices fundamentally altered this dynamic in ways the entertainment industry still struggles to comprehend. When public figures began directly challenging media narratives on social media, responding to coverage in real time, and encouraging their supporters to question traditional sources, the old rules of public discourse were essentially broken. Suddenly, a late-night comedian couldn't make a claim about a political figure without that figure potentially responding directly to millions of followers within hours. The traditional buffer that existed between entertainment figures and political consequences simply evaporated. This wasn't just about one public figure. It was about a broader foundational shift in how information and influence flow through our society. The result has been a cascading series of changes throughout the media landscape that many in the entertainment industry are still trying to process. Major news organizations that had operated with relative impunity for decades suddenly faced sustained scrutiny and financial pressure. Even institutions once considered unassailable saw their foundational support erode as their inherent biases became impossible to ignore. Other prominent entertainment figures, whose careers were built on a specific type of political commentary, found their relevance declining as their targets faded from prominence. Mainstream personalities were forced to acknowledge biases that had previously gone unexamined. The protective ecosystem that had shielded certain media figures from meaningful accountability was crumbling from multiple directions simultaneously. And with legacy media weakened, new players stepped in to claim the throne. This is where, as a businessman and author, I encourage you to listen closely, because nature abhors a vacuum, especially in the world of entertainment and ideas. As traditional late-night shows lost audiences and credibility, alternative voices experienced explosive growth that caught almost everyone off guard. The success of certain shows became a perfect illustration of this shift. Here were personalities who had been in more marginal positions just a few years earlier, suddenly commanding audiences that dwarfed anything the major broadcast networks could generate. Their success wasn't accidental. They were providing something that millions of Americans had been craving but couldn't find elsewhere. They offered entertainment that didn't constantly lecture or judge the audience's beliefs or values. They could offer commentary that felt authentic, that wasn't beholden to a partisan script. Most importantly, they seemed to genuinely respect and connect with their audience, rather than viewing them as people who needed to be educated or corrected. That difference in approach proved enormously significant in cultivating loyalty and trust. But the transformations extended far beyond traditional television. Independent creators on platforms like YouTube and various podcast networks began attracting audiences that rivaled, and often surpassed anything the major networks could produce. These creators possessed advantages that traditional media simply could not match. They could respond to current events instantaneously. They weren't constrained by corporate sponsors' anxieties about political content, and they could forge direct, authentic relationships with their audiences without network interference. What made this particularly devastating for someone like the late-night host was that these alternative voices weren't just offering different political perspectives. They were often more engaging, more authentic, and more directly responsive to what their audiences actually desired. When you can receive funnier, more honest commentary from someone operating out of a home studio than from a multi-million-dollar network production, the traditional advantages of big media begin to look increasingly irrelevant. Even more surprising was how this cultural shift began to attract voices from completely unexpected corners of the entertainment world. An entrepreneur who built a career in makeup and fashion, for example, suddenly found himself becoming a significant voice in cultural commentary simply by being willing to state that celebrating political assassinations was morally wrong, regardless of the victim's political beliefs. His public stance defending the victim and criticizing the celebration of his death highlighted a crucial change in the cultural landscape. Here was an individual with millions of followers, many of them young people who traditionally might not engage with certain political content, speaking out against the mainstream entertainment industry's response to a tragedy. The fact that he experienced a temporary dip in followers but gained even more new ones for taking that stand reveals something profound about where American culture is heading. There is a deep hunger for voices willing to prioritize basic human decency, truth, and respect over political tribalism, even when that means challenging established narratives within their own industries or communities. This pattern has replicated itself across social media and entertainment platforms. Creators who were willing to deviate from expected political positions, particularly when it meant upholding fundamental principles of fairness or accuracy, often found themselves connecting with audiences they had never anticipated reaching. The rigid ideological categories that had defined entertainment and politics for decades were breaking down in favor of more nuanced, human-centered approaches. Which brings us back to the host, not just one man's downfall, but a powerful symbol of an era concluding. The lesson that Hollywood is slowly, sometimes painfully, internalizing is that the era of consequence-free political grandstanding is over. For years, entertainment figures could make provocative statements, disseminate questionable information, or mock large segments of the American public with minimal risk to their careers or their financial bottom lines. The industry had cultivated sophisticated systems for safeguarding its own, particularly when controversial statements aligned with prevailing political sentiments. But what happened represents the collapse of that protective system. When your statements become so inflammatory that they threaten vital business or relationships, when fact-checkers can immediately contradict your claims with verifiable evidence, and when audiences have readily available alternatives that better serve their needs, suddenly the old rules cease to apply. This isn't just about conservative versus liberal politics. It's about audiences rejecting the assumption that they should tolerate being lectured, misled, or insulted by those who are meant to entertain them. The social contract between entertainers and audiences has fundamentally shifted. It is no longer sufficient simply to be on television or to command a major platform. You must actively earn and consistently maintain your audience's trust and loyalty. Disney's decisive action, despite years of supporting the host's commentary, demonstrates how quickly these calculations can change when the fundamental business realities shift. Entertainment companies are, at their core, businesses. And when a performer transitions from being an asset to a liability, even long-standing relationships and ideological alignments become secondary considerations. The broader lesson extends far beyond late-night comedy. Across Hollywood, performers, writers, and executives are being compelled to reconsider assumptions that had guided their careers for decades. The notion of a safe political position that will insulate you from controversy has largely evaporated. Instead, enduring success increasingly hinges on authenticity, accuracy, and genuine respect for your audience, qualities that the old system often discouraged in favor of ideological conformity. And that leads to the true reason behind this unfortunate cancellation, a reason that should prompt every entertainer to take notice. While the political controversy provided the immediate impetus for the host's downfall, the deeper truth is that he had already become a liability from a purely business perspective. The harsh reality of entertainment, as in any business, is that talent, political leanings, and even controversy can often be forgiven if you are generating profits and creating value. But when you cease to be profitable and begin creating significant problems, even the most powerful networks will eventually mitigate their losses. His ratings had been in steady decline for years before this specific controversy. His audience was aging, his reach was shrinking, and his cost per viewer was becoming increasingly difficult to justify to corporate executives who must answer to shareholders and board members. The show was essentially operating on institutional momentum rather than actual market demand. When the controversy erupted, it provided Disney executives with something they had been quietly seeking for months: a clean exit strategy that allowed them to avoid simply canceling a show for poor performance. They could frame the decision as a principled stand on public responsibility and broadcast standards, rather than conceding that one of their flagship programs had simply become financially unsustainable. This dynamic explains why the industry response was so swift and so decisive. In previous eras, networks might have endured significant controversy to protect a highly profitable show. But when a show is already struggling financially, controversy becomes the final unavoidable straw rather than a challenge to be overcome. The real lesson here isn't about cancel culture or political correctness. It's about the fundamental economics of entertainment in a rapidly evolving media landscape. Audiences now possess more choices than ever before, and they are increasingly willing to vote with their attention and their resources when content fails to meet their expectations or disrespects their intelligence. For entertainers who have built their careers around the old model of protected controversy, this represents an existential challenge. The assumption that networks or streaming platforms will shield them from consequences is no longer reliable when those same platforms are facing their own survival pressures in an increasingly competitive marketplace. This situation signals not just the cultural shift away from traditional late-night comedy, but the financial recalibration of a model that once seemed untouchable. When major broadcast networks are willing to abandon expensive productions and establish relationships over a single controversial incident, it vividly demonstrates just how precarious the entertainment industry's economics have become. So, what profound takeaways can we glean from all this, my friends? It's bigger than one individual. It's about the profound shift occurring right now in our culture and how principles of business and human connection are reasserting themselves. What we're witnessing is truly a case study in how quickly established institutions can lose their relevance when they cease to effectively serve their audiences with integrity and respect. For those of us who have navigated major technological and cultural shifts before, there's a familiar pattern here. It's the same dynamic we've observed play out in industry after industry over the past several decades. The entertainment world operated for generations under certain assumptions: that audiences had limited alternatives, that controversial political statements from a certain viewpoint carried minimal risk, and that established media companies could weather almost any storm through institutional support and industry connections. All of those assumptions have now been definitively proven false in today's environment. What is emerging in their place is something far more responsive to actual audience preferences and far less tolerant of poor performance or disrespect, regardless of political alignment. This isn't necessarily about conservative versus liberal politics. It's about fundamental competence, authenticity, and profound respect for the people who choose to invest their valuable time and attention in your content. The speed with which this individual transitioned from a protected late-night institution to an industry liability demonstrates just how rapidly these changes can accelerate once they reach a tipping point. Network executives who had been content to overlook declining ratings and growing audience dissatisfaction suddenly found themselves facing regulatory pressure, affiliate rebellion, and sponsor nervousness all at once. But perhaps most importantly, they discovered that their traditional tools for managing controversy, corporate statements, publicist damage control, friendly entertainment reporters, were largely ineffective against sustained criticism from independent voices who could reach audiences directly and provide immediate fact-checking and context. This represents a fundamental shift in how cultural power operates in America. For the first time in decades, establishment media institutions are genuinely vulnerable to grassroots accountability in ways that create real consequences for major figures. The protective barriers that once shielded entertainment elites from the effects of their statements and decisions have largely crumbled. What this means for all of us, especially those who remember when media institutions commanded much more automatic respect and deference, is that we are entering a period of genuine competition in the marketplace of ideas and entertainment. No longer can a handful of executives in New York and Los Angeles unilaterally determine what the rest of the country will find funny, interesting, or worthy of attention. The new landscape rewards authenticity, accuracy, and genuine connection with audiences over ideological conformity or institutional support. It's undeniably messier and more unpredictable than the old system, but it is also far more responsive to what people actually want, rather than what industry elites think they should want. For us, as discerning viewers and consumers, this creates both tremendous opportunities and significant responsibilities. We have access to a more diverse array of voices and perspectives than ever before, but we also need to be more discerning consumers of information and entertainment. The old gatekeepers are gone, which means we all must become better at evaluating sources and thinking critically about what we are consuming. The situation ultimately represents the growing pains of this profound transition. An entertainer who built his career under the old rules discovered that those rules no longer apply, and the industry that once protected him found that such protection was no longer economically viable. What emerged from that collision was a clearer picture of how entertainment and media will operate in the years ahead: more competitive, more accountable, and more directly responsive to audience preferences. And now, my friends, I would love to hear your thoughts. Was this a necessary realignment? Do you believe late-night entertainment lost its way years ago when it prioritized political messaging over genuine entertainment and connection? Have you found yourself turning away from traditional television in favor of other sources that uplift your spirit and expand your perspective? These changes affect all of us, regardless of our political beliefs, because they are fundamentally about whether we want our entertainment and information sources to respect us as intelligent adults or to treat us as people who need to be managed and directed. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And if this breakdown helped you understand the deeper principles at play behind these headline-grabbing stories, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Because the more people understand these deeper dynamics, these universal truths, the harder it becomes for media giants to obscure the real reasons behind their decisions. The future belongs to voices that earn trust rather than demand it, and to audiences that think for themselves rather than passively accepting what they are told. This individual's downfall isn't the end of the story. It's the powerful beginning of something much more interesting, a recalibration towards authenticity and enduring connection.